There's a pattern in history where individuals become so wealthy they stop being businessmen and start operating as sovereign powers. And in 1913, one man controlled 2% of America's entire economic output. Not a company, not a government, one man. John D. Rockefeller. At his peak, his wealth reached $400 billion in today's dollars, making him richer than the current GDP of countries like Pakistan, Denmark, or Egypt. He controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. He determined which cities got fuel and which froze. He decided which railroads survived and which went bankrupt. He owned the politicians who wrote the laws and the judges who enforced them. And here's what nobody tells you. The methods he used to build that empire, the monopolistic playbook he perfected, is still being used today by tech giants, pharmaceutical companies, and financial institutions. This is the story of how one man weaponized capitalism itself, and why understanding his rise explains everything about wealth concentration in 2025. Before we go through Rockefeller's specific tactics, you need to understand what America looked like when he started. It's 1863. The Civil War is ending. America has barely any industrial infrastructure. There's no national oil industry because nobody's figured out how to refine kerosene efficiently or build a distribution network. Small refineries are popping up in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Pennsylvania, all competing chaotically, most losing money, none with any market power. Oil is being discovered, but it's messy, dangerous work with wild price swings. In 1859, oil was $20 a barrel. By 1861, it crashed to 10 cents. Fortunes were made and lost in months. It was financial chaos. And chaos is where Rockefeller saw opportunity. Because while everyone else was drilling for oil, he understood something they didn't. The real money wasn't in finding oil. It was in controlling what happened to it after it came out of the ground. Refining, transportation, distribution, control the choke points, and you control everything. That's not theoretical. That's exactly what he did. And he did it so ruthlessly, so systematically, that by 1880 he'd eliminated nearly every competitor in America. Let's start with 1863, Cleveland, Ohio. Rockefeller is 24 years old. He's made some money in produce during the Civil War, supplying the Union Army. But he's watching the oil boom, and he's doing something nobody else is doing. He's reading the railroad contracts. He's analyzing refinery costs. He's calculating margins. While speculators are getting rich and going broke on oil wells, Rockefeller opens a refinery with $4,000 in capital. Not an oil well, a refinery. He's not gambling on finding oil. He's positioning himself at the bottleneck where crude oil becomes sellable kerosene. And immediately, he starts optimizing. He negotiates secret deals with railroads for lower shipping rates in exchange for guaranteed volume. He builds his own barrel-making operation because buying barrels from suppliers is cutting into margins. He captures the byproducts nobody else is monetizing, selling petroleum jelly, paraffin wax, and industrial lubricants. Within 4 years, his Cleveland refinery is the most efficient in America. But efficiency isn't enough for Rockefeller. He wants elimination. Here's where it gets darker. In 1870, Rockefeller creates Standard Oil, not just a company, a structure designed for predatory expansion, and he immediately launches what becomes known as the Cleveland Massacre. Here's how it worked. Rockefeller goes to every refinery owner in Cleveland one by one. He offers to buy them out. If they sell, he pays fair market value. If they refuse, he triggers a price war he knows they can't survive. He drops kerosene prices below cost. His larger volume and railroad rebates let him sustain losses that bankrupt smaller refineries within months. Then he buys their assets for pennies on the dollar. In 1870, there were 26 refineries in Cleveland. By 1872, Rockefeller owned 22 of them. The 4 that remained were too small to matter. And Cleveland was just the beginning. He replicated this pattern in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in New York, in every refining center in America. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's refining capacity, not through innovation, through elimination. But Rockefeller wasn't just building a monopoly, he was building a machine that printed money by controlling every step of production. Let me show you exactly how this works. Standard Oil didn't just refine oil, it owned the pipelines that transported crude from wells to refineries. It owned the railroad tank cars that shipped kerosene to markets. It owned the distribution terminals in every major city. It owned the retail networks that sold to consumers. Vertical integration isn't just efficiency, it's a weapon. If you're an independent oil producer, you need Rockefeller's pipelines to move your crude. He sets the price. If you're a retailer, you need his distribution network. He sets the terms. If you try to compete at any level, he can squeeze you at 5 different choke points simultaneously. And this is where it gets mathematically devastating. In 1870, refining a gallon of kerosene cost 2.5 cents. By 1885, through ruthless optimization and scale, Rockefeller got it down to 0.5 cents. He could sell kerosene at 1 cent per gallon and still profit while everyone else went bankrupt at 2 cents. This wasn't fair competition. This was industrial warfare designed to make competition mathematically impossible. Now let's talk about the railroad deals, because this is where Rockefeller's genius becomes predatory. In the 1870s, railroads are desperate for business. They're overbuilt, competing viciously, operating on thin margins. Rockefeller approaches the major railroads, the Erie, the New York Central, the Pennsylvania Railroad, with a proposition. Standard Oil will guarantee massive, consistent shipping volume. In exchange, the railroads give him rebates, secret discounts that his competitors don't get. But here's the part that should terrify you. Rockefeller doesn't just get rebates on his own shipments. He negotiates drawbacks, payments to Standard Oil on every gallon his competitors ship on those same railroads. Let that sink in. If you're a competitor shipping oil on the Erie Railroad, you're not just paying higher rates than Rockefeller. You're literally funding Standard Oil with every barrel you ship. Your shipping costs are subsidizing your own destruction. When this came out in congressional hearings, even the senators were stunned. One independent refiner testified that his shipping costs were double Rockefeller's, and Standard Oil was receiving 50 cents for every barrel he shipped. Rockefeller's response when asked about this under oath, "It's simply good business." And legally at the time it was. There were no antitrust laws, no regulations against this. Rockefeller was operating in a legal vacuum, and he exploited it completely. By 1882, Rockefeller controls 90% of oil refining, and he's facing a problem. Standard Oil is too big, too visible, and state laws limit how corporations can operate across state lines. So he invents something new, the trust. He creates the Standard Oil Trust, a legal structure where shareholders of 40 different companies transfer their shares to a board of 9 trustees controlled by Rockefeller. Suddenly, it's not one company. It's a network of companies that appears independent but operates as one entity. The trust structure lets Rockefeller coordinate pricing, divide markets, eliminate competition, all while maintaining the fiction of separate companies. Other industries immediately copy this model. Sugar Trust, Whiskey Trust, Steel Trust. Rockefeller didn't just build a monopoly, he invented the modern corporate structure for monopolistic control. And here's the key. This structure is still being used today. Tech platforms, private equity firms, pharmaceutical conglomerates, they're using variations of the trust model to coordinate without officially merging. The mechanics have evolved, but the strategy is identical. Let's talk about what this wealth actually meant in human terms. In 1913, Rockefeller's net worth hits $900 million. Adjusted for inflation and economic growth, that's $400 billion today. For context, Elon Musk's peak net worth was $340 billion. Jeff Bezos peaked around $210 billion. Rockefeller was wealthier, but more importantly, his wealth represented 2% of America's entire GDP. Imagine someone today with wealth equal to 2% of the 28 trillion US dollars economy. That's $560 billion. Nobody's close. But it's not just the number, it's what the wealth represented. Rockefeller could fund political campaigns, buy legislatures, influence presidents. He employed 100,000 people directly and controlled hundreds of thousands more through his distribution network. Cities depended on Standard Oil for heating fuel. Factories depended on it for industrial lubricants. The American economy had a single point of failure, and that point was one man. When muckrakers and journalists started exposing Standard Oil's practices, Rockefeller hired PR firms to reshape his image. He started giving away massive sums to universities, medical research, churches, the Rockefeller Foundation, the University of Chicago, Rockefeller Center. This wasn't generosity. This was reputation laundering. Buy enough hospitals and libraries, and people forget you destroyed thousands of businesses and families to build your fortune. But beneath the surface, the government was finally moving. Ida Tarbell, a journalist whose father was bankrupted by Rockefeller, publishes The History of Standard Oil in 1904, a 19-part expose documenting every predatory tactic. Public outrage builds. Teddy Roosevelt makes trust busting his signature issue. In 1906, the federal government sues Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case takes 5 years. In 1911, the Supreme Court orders Standard Oil dissolved into 34 separate companies. Rockefeller loses his monopoly, except he doesn't. Here's what actually happened. Rockefeller owned a quarter of Standard Oil's shares. When the company split into 34 pieces, he owned a quarter of all 34 pieces. And without the monopoly suppressing competition, oil demand exploded. Cars were becoming mainstream. Each of those 34 companies grew rapidly. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco. They all came from Standard Oil. Rockefeller's wealth tripled after the breakup. The government thought they were punishing him. They made him 3 times richer. He won by losing. Now let's talk about 2025 and why this pattern matters. Look at the tech platforms. Google controls 92% of global search. Amazon controls 40% of US e-commerce. Apple's App Store controls access to 1 billion devices. Facebook owns Instagram and WhatsApp, controlling how 3 billion people communicate. These aren't just big companies. They're choke point monopolies, exactly like Standard Oil. They control the infrastructure everyone else depends on. If you're a business, you need Google to be found, Amazon to reach customers, Apple's App Store to reach iPhone users. They set the terms, they take their cut. If you compete, they can copy your product, bury you in search results, or ban you from their platform. The mechanics are identical to Rockefeller's railroad rebates, and when regulators try to break them up, the same playbook runs. Claim you're benefiting consumers through efficiency. Hire the best lawyers money can buy. Drag cases out for years. Make the breakup cost more than it's worth. Even if they lose, they win. Breaking up Meta means Zuckerberg owns pieces of Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook separately. Just like Rockefeller, his wealth increases. Let's look at the current wealth concentration numbers because the pattern is identical. In 1913, Rockefeller controlled 2% of US GDP. In 2025, the top 1% of Americans control 32% of all wealth. The top 0.1% control 20%. 10 individuals have a combined net worth of $1.5 trillion, roughly 5% of US GDP. We've returned to Gilded Age inequality levels. But here's what makes it darker. Rockefeller operated in an era with no antitrust laws. Today's billionaires operate in an era where those laws exist but aren't enforced. The last major antitrust breakup was AT&T in 1982. We've had 40 years of consolidation with no structural intervention. Tech platforms, pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, financial institutions, they've all studied the Rockefeller playbook. Vertical integration, choke point control, regulatory capture. The difference is they're better at it because they learned from his mistakes. They diversify across industries so no single company looks too dominant. They use lobbying instead of direct bribery. They frame monopolistic control as innovation. Here's what you need to understand about how this ends. Historical monopolies collapse in one of 3 ways. Government intervention through antitrust enforcement, which requires political will that currently doesn't exist. Market disruption through new technology, which is possible but rare when incumbents can buy or crush startups. Or economic crisis that destroys the foundation of their power. Rockefeller's monopoly broke during a period of progressive reform and public outrage. Current monopolies exist during a period of regulatory capture and political fragmentation. The government agencies meant to prevent consolidation are run by former industry executives. The politicians who could pass new antitrust laws receive campaign funding from the companies they'd be regulating. The media companies that could drive public outrage are owned by the same billionaire class. The system is designed to protect itself. And that's not conspiracy. That's documented reality. So we're left waiting for option 3, the economic crisis that's severe enough to force structural change. Let me show you what this looks like in real terms. Rockefeller's monopoly lasted 40 years before breaking. During that time, he destroyed thousands of businesses, concentrated wealth to unprecedented levels, and distorted the entire American economy. When it finally broke, it required massive public mobilization, muckraking journalism, and a president willing to fight the most powerful man in America. Today's monopolies have existed for 20 to 25 years. Google since 1998, Amazon since 1994, Facebook since 2004. We're halfway through the cycle if the pattern holds. But there's no Ida Tarbell exposing them in mainstream publications. There's no Teddy Roosevelt making trust-busting his mission. There's regulatory theater, congressional hearings where CEOs testify and nothing changes, and fines that are fractions of quarterly profits. The mechanisms that broke Rockefeller's monopoly don't exist in functional form today, which means either we're waiting longer or we're waiting for something worse than government intervention to force the break. 5 times. 5 major American monopoly periods. The railroad monopolies of the 1870s, Rockefeller's oil trust in the 1880s to 1910s, the robber baron era trusts of the 1890s, AT&T's telephone monopoly from 1913 to 1982, and the current tech platform monopolies from 1998 to present. Each believed they were different. Each believed they were too efficient to break up. Each believed they provided too much value to touch. They were wrong every single time. Either the government intervened, or markets disrupted them, or crisis destroyed them. None survived in monopoly form. But here's what should terrify you. The wealth they concentrated didn't disappear. Rockefeller stayed rich after Standard Oil broke up. Bell family fortunes survived AT&T's breakup. The wealth accumulation is permanent even when the monopoly structure breaks. And that means even if current monopolies break, the billionaire class they created remains, with all the political power and economic control that implies. Now let's talk about the United States in 2025 and why every warning sign is flashing red. We've completed 5 of the 7 stages that preceded every previous monopoly breakup. Stage 1, unchecked consolidation. Check. We've had 40 years of merger approvals and 0 major breakups. Stage 2, vertical integration into infrastructure. Check. Tech platforms control the digital infrastructure everyone depends on. Stage 3, regulatory capture. Check. Former tech executives run the FTC and SEC. Stage 4, wealth concentration to historic levels. Check. Gilded Age inequality has returned. Stage 5, public awareness without political action. Check. Everyone knows the platforms are monopolies. Nobody's doing anything about it. We're on stage 5 of 7. Previous examples made it to stage 6, political crisis that forces action before breaking. We're not approaching the pattern. We're deep inside it. Stage 6 is political destabilization as monopolistic wealth distorts democracy. That's starting. Billionaires buying media companies to control information flow. Campaign finance completely dominated by the ultra-wealthy. Policy decisions that benefit monopolies despite public opposition. This stage accelerates until either reform happens or the system breaks. Stage 7 is economic crisis that destroys the foundation of monopoly power. In Rockefeller's era, it was the progressive era and World War I disrupting global markets. For AT&T, it was the 1970s stagflation forcing deregulation. For current monopolies, it would be a financial crisis, severe enough that governments are forced to act structurally rather than symbolically. Maybe we have 5 years, maybe 10, maybe less. But the pattern says reform is coming. And when it comes, it won't be gradual. It'll be sudden, forced by a crisis, and painful for everyone involved. 5 times, 5 monopolistic periods. Same wealth concentration pattern, same regulatory capture, same public anger without action until crisis forces change. Each time they thought they were different. Each time the monopolists believed their efficiency justified their power. Each time they believed they were too important to break up. Each time the pattern won. American exceptionalism says it can't happen here, that tech monopolies are too innovative to touch. That's what they said about Standard Oil. And Rockefeller lost his monopoly while tripling his wealth. The same outcome is coming for today's monopolists. The company structures will break, the fortunes will remain, and the pattern will continue because we're not learning from Rockefeller's era. We're repeating it. If this opened your eyes to how monopolistic wealth actually accumulates and why the current tech platforms are following Rockefeller's exact playbook, subscribe. Because when the next stage hits, when the political crisis forces action or the economic crisis breaks the current structure, you'll want to understand what's happening and why. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past. Rockefeller showed us the playbook. Today's billionaires are just running the same plays with better PR. The pattern doesn't change, only the names do. And understanding that pattern is the only way to see what's coming next.